So here's the spreadsheet that will help us understand the computation of the capital adequacy ratio. In the very first worksheet, I presented only the balance sheet of the Bank of Utopia. So what we have here, the assets and the liabilities of the Bank of Utopia. The total size of the balance sheet is 6 billion currency units. Now please note, for ease of understanding, I have abridged this balance sheet, so we have here only those line items that are relevant for our understanding of capital adequacy ratio. Now those of you who might be intrigued by this phrase off balance sheet or contingent liability, this is a very important component in the financial statement of any bank. Let me try and interpret a couple of them for you. Letters of credit, for instance, are issued in any export-import transaction. Now why is this called an off balance sheet or a contingent liability? If all payments are made on time, then there is no liability at all for the bank. However, if any of the customers fail to pay their obligation on time, then it would devolve on the bank. That's why it is called a contingent liability. Now, contingent liabilities are treated differently when you compute capital adequacy ratio, which we will see in a few minutes from now. Having understood the balance sheet, both the asset side and the liability side, let's now look at how to compute the tier 1 and tier 2 capital. If you look carefully at the worksheet that's in front of you now, what is classified as tier 1 capital, which is equity capital, retained earnings and perpetual preference shares, are actually on the top 3 lines of the balance sheet right here. And that's, in this example, the total of tier 1 capital, which works out to 325 million currency units. The rest of the lines on the liability side of the balance sheet, which is revaluation reserves, provision for bad loans and subordinated debt, would form tier 2 capital. A couple of observations here. Please note, customer deposits, which is deposits kept by the customers with the bank, will not get into the capital adequacy calculation. Remember, as the name suggests, it's only the items that relate to capital and reserves and provisions that will get into this calculation. Now remember, in the previous session I talked to you about a couple of caveats in the computation of capital. First caveat, subordinated debt cannot exceed 50% of total tier 1 capital. Now the subordinated debt as shown on the balance sheet is 175, tier 1 capital is 325, so we can only consider 162.5, which is 50% of 325 in our calculation for capital. Second caveat, the total tier 2 capital cannot exceed 100% of tier 1 capital. So tier 2 capital is 412.5, tier 1 capital is only 325, so only 325 can go into this calculation. Now we can only consider 325 out of that 412 for our capital adequacy calculations. So we got 325, which is tier 1 capital, 325, which is tier 2 capital, less the investments made by this bank in the equity stock of other institutions is 75. That must be subtracted, so you get a net figure of 575. So we've calculated tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital. Our next task is to compute the risk weighted assets. Now if you look at what's on this table that computes the risk weighted assets, we have from the balance sheet we have obtained the following numbers: investment in government securities, investment in corporate bonds, commercial loans, mortgage loans, fixed assets and cash. Remember, the only item on the asset side, which is 75, was included as a reduction item in the tier 1 tier 2 capital computation that we saw just a minute ago. These items are taken from the asset side of the balance sheet. What you have in the next column is the risk weight based on the degree of risk of each of these asset classes. For example, investment in government securities is completely free of default risk or credit risk. In other words, there is no likelihood that a government will not meet its repayment obligations, and therefore the risk weight is 0. Investment in corporate bonds, on the other hand, there is a high probability of default by the issuer of the bonds, therefore the risk weight is 100%. Same would be true for commercial loans. Mortgage loans, on the other hand, are backed by the asset called the home for which the loan has been extended. So in the event of default, that home can be sold and the loan recovered. Therefore, the risk weight on that is only 50%. Fixed assets carry 0 risk weight, cash carry 0 risk weight. What we have in this column is a multiplication of the actual number obtained from the balance sheet into the risk weight. So the total asset of 5925 with these risk weights now works out to risk weighted assets of 5 billion currency units. We repeat the same computation for the off balance sheet items, which is in the lower half of the spreadsheet that you are now looking at. So this is the risk weighted computation for off balance sheet items. It works very similar to what we saw in the earlier computation, except that there is an additional factor called the conversion factor. This is known by different names in different countries. Let me try and explain this for you. These numbers are taken straight from the list that we saw here, no difference. So this total of 1975 is reflected here as well. Now what is this conversion factor? What we are saying is the following. There is a 50% chance that the financial guarantee that we issued might devolve on the bank. In other words, it will have a cash outflow obligation on account of that guarantee. Same is true for a letter of credit, same is true for a performance bond, and so on and so forth. In other words, the amount at risk is not the 250 but 50% of that 250. In other words, there is a 1 in 2 chance that this financial guarantee would devolve on the bank. However, when it devolves, the bank will be called upon to pay 100% of whatever is defaulted. So 250 into 50% into the 100% gives you this figure of 125. It is the same computation that we have done for each of these lines, and therefore the total risk weighted assets works out to 727.5 as against an off balance sheet number of 1975. The total risk weighted assets would be the sum of this 5000, which is the risk weighted assets for the on balance sheet assets, and the 727.5 is the risk weighted asset computation for the off balance sheet assets. The two together works out to 5000 plus 727.5 gives you 5727.5. Now just to recap, we had a total capital of 575, and then we computed the risk weighted assets, which came up to 5727.5. So that gives us all the data we need to calculate the capital adequacy ratio of this institution. Tier 1 plus Tier 2 capital 575, risk weighted assets 5727.50. Therefore the capital adequacy is 10.04. Remember, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has specified a minimum of 8%. So this institution is higher than 8%, which means it has got sufficient capital measured from the point of view of the capital adequacy ratio. Hope that spreadsheet example helped you understand the concept of Tier 1 capital, Tier 2 capital, risk weighted assets, and the computation of the capital adequacy ratio. It may be appropriate to mention here that most financial systems have grown in complexity over the last 20 years, that is since the mid-90s when the Basel I capital adequacy ratio model was implemented. Hence, the capital adequacy ratio guidelines issued under Basel I have been superseded by the more complex and contemporary Basel II, and more recently by the Basel III guidelines. We will look at Basel II and Basel III guidelines in detail in a later week in this course.